Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this part 8, we're going to talk about risk management. All right, so risk management is a very broad topic, and we're not going to do a whole lot of justice here, but I'm going to do my best. So risk management is how an organization identifies any factors that could lead to damage or reduction in value of an asset. So risk is the reduction of value in an asset. That's the easy way to think about it. So using asset value, countermeasures, and solutions for reduction or mitigating the risk to discover all the overall risk that is associated with that asset. So we do this through assessment, response, and awareness. In the assessment, we look at the environment. We try to understand what the risk is associated with that environment, and then what the likelihood and the severity or the impact is. That risk to that environment and the assets that are part of that environment. Then there's a response. It's the evaluate the countermeasures, the safeguards, and the security controls that are there to help reduce the risk and understand that versus the benefit of putting that control in place. And then the last part here is the awareness. So increasing the knowledge of the risk within the organization. So those are kind of the 3 different parts of risk management. So some of the terms that we'll talk about here, so there's safeguards, or what we could call controls. So these are what removes or reduces the impact to a vulnerability and protects against a threat. An attack is an intentional attempted exploitation of a vulnerability. A breach is the bypassing or circumventing of security controls by a threat. 2 other terms that we should really bring out here too in terms of risk management, because they come up often, is the end of life and end of service. And the reason these come up is because some risks, if you identify a risk in a system and that system is going to be end of life in the next 2 months, you may not want to spend a lot of time to try to resolve any of the risks that are associated with that system. You may just wait for the end of life and put the most amount of protective controls that you have around it. So end of life is really when a product is no longer being produced by an organization. The end of service is the point in which the product is no longer receiving updates or support. And end of service you can think of, I think we're all familiar with Windows, Microsoft Windows, and the end of service on some of the operating systems that they periodically put out. So there's a couple different parts of this risk management, the phases of risk management. So we have the identifying the threats and the vulnerabilities. We have the risk assessment and analysis. We have a response from that analysis. We have a cost versus the benefit controls. Then we put in the controls and we assess whether they're working. We monitor, we measure, we report, and then we have a continuous improvement back into the process. So we're going to talk about each one of these going forward here. So identifying threats. You want to create a list of the threats not just the threats that could occur, those threat events, but also the threat agents. And I think we talked a little bit about that before, where threat agents are those that are particularly interested in your specific industry. And so you want to create this list of threat agents and the threat events that are possible against the organization and the assets within the organization. This is going to be your threat, catalog. It's important to take into consideration the unique business that you're in. So if you're in the financial space, you're going to have a different set of threat agents and threat events. If you're in the financial space, you're going to have, different threat agents, different events. Also, depending on your system, where it's geographically located, or the types of activity that's going on around where your systems are hosted, that could also make your threats different compared to other organizations. And a team, rather than individuals, should perform this risk assessment. Really, you want to have more eyes on the creation of that generation of that threat list. You want to have more eyes on that than fewer, because you want to make sure that you're getting a diverse background and a diverse set of feedback into that threat generation. So we talked a little bit about qualitative, quantitative, and if you remember, quantitative comes down to the numbers, and qualitative is gut feeling. So, once you have that inventory of threats and assets, you want to calculate that risk, and you calculate that risk using both qualitative and quantitative methods in order to put value to that asset. So again, just as an example, you might, be trying to find what the value is of a database in a data center. And you might have some quantitative type of metrics around that, which would state that, well, there's 1,000 records in there, and each record is worth $1 each in that database, just hypothetically. And then you might have qualitative saying, hey, the data on there is worth a lot more, or there's other. You might send out a survey saying, what's the actual impact of this database being lost? And somebody might come back and say, oh, well, there's, a lot of legacy data on there or something. There might be something about it that maybe is not quite quantitative, but qualitative in its nature. And then you also want to think about the Delphi technique. We'll talk about that here in a bit, but it's a method to get anonymous feedback in order to evaluate risk and implement a solution. So it's really a questionnaire to get that anonymous feedback from stakeholders and from those that are familiar with the system in order to get that risk and identify a solution. So the Delphi technique, and you're going to want to know this for the exam, Delphi technique is a way of getting anonymous feedback, typically through questionnaires. So what's the responses that we have when it comes down to identifying risk? There is mitigation or reduction, which basically means putting a control in place that reduces the impact of that risk. There's an assignment or a transfer, meaning that we could transfer the risk to a third party. That could be that maybe we don't host the system in our data center, and therefore certain risks around physical damage to that system are not ours to own. It's owned by the third party that's hosting that system. There's deterrence, so we can put in place different controls that will be able to deter somebody from trying to pose a threat to that asset, and that could be the security controls that we talk about, security guards, maybe signage and things like that say, hey, stay away. There could be avoidance where you basically are able to remediate the issue, meaning that you put in a fix or you make it so that it is completely immune to the risk that at least you identified. There's acceptance where you could say, okay, we know that this is a risk, and this is where that end of life comes into play, because it's a risk, but that the system will be end of life here in 2 months, and therefore we're going to say the risk is acceptable for us at this point. We have enough security controls around to limit, to mitigate or reduce that risk until it's end of life. And then you can just reject or ignore. That's not typically done, but it's definitely an option where you can identified risk. Somebody can just say, hey, you know what? We don't care. And again, it's not always a valid response, but it is definitely a response that could occur. So there's a couple different terms when we talk about risk. There's the total risk, residual risk, and then the controls gap. So total risk is the risk to the organization without any controls in place. In other words, you haven't done anything to reduce the risk. This is the naked risk that's there. It's the total risk. And what that is, as far as the calculation goes, is that you have your threats, multiply that by your vulnerabilities, by your asset value, and you get your total risk. And that should be a dollar amount. And then you have your residual risk, and that's the accepted risk by the organization opposed to mitigation. So that means that your total risk minus the controls gap equals your residual risk. So you have your total risk, which is the threats, the vulnerabilities, the asset value. And then you have your controls gap, which is the amount of risk that is reduced by the safeguard. So you may have, certain controls in place that therefore reduce that risk, and it's going to reduce it by X amount. That's going to be the controls gap. So your total risk minus the controls gap is going to be your residual risk. So cost versus benefit. And we talked a little bit before about ALE and ARO. So annualized loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence. So loss expectancy means how much am I going to lose per year based on this risk. Annualized rate of occurrence is, how often is this threat going to occur? Annual cost of the safeguard, which is the ACS, is going to be the total ownership of that safeguard. So that includes the purchase of any kind of the control, the development, the licensing around it, the implementation, and the customization. So once you buy it, let's say you buy a control let's say it's antivirus, right, to manage data loss protection or things like that, or antivirus on a laptop to stop malware from being installed. So you're going to have the purchase cost, you're going to have any kind of licensing agreement, the implementation, you have to have that rolled out to all your machines that are in the organization. You might have to do some customization on some of the machines that you push that out to. And then there's ongoing operation, maintenance, and administration of that control. And in this case, it's antivirus. Then you have to maintain the upgrades on that. So new signatures come out, new versions come out. Any kind of issues in terms of repairs that you would have to do to the system, maybe to the antivirus, if that should occur. Then you have productivity improvement or loss. So in AV, if those of us that are familiar with antivirus, we know that sometimes that it impedes activity, especially in development environments or testing environments. And then you might have to do some environment changes to support that antivirus. And then there's the testing and evaluation. So when you think about getting a safeguard or a control in place, there's not just the dollar amount that you sign when you make a purchase. There is a lot of other, additional costs that are part of that safeguard. And those are the ACSs, that annual cost of a safeguard. So let's talk a little bit about, the cost versus benefit again here. Looking at that table here on the right, you have your asset value, which should be a dollar amount. We talked about that previously. The exposure factor, same thing, should be a percentage. We talked about that previously. SLE, the single loss expectancy, is, the asset value and the damage that could occur to that asset based on an event, a threat. And that's going to be the one-time cost of loss. Then you have your annual rate of occurrence. So how often does that threat happen? I think the example we used before is a flood. If you have a flood that happens once a year, that ARO should be an amount by year. Then you have your, as opposed to the single loss expectancy, you have your annual loss expectancy, which is going to be your ALE, your SLE, multiplied by your ARO. In other words, the amount of time something happens in a year multiplied by the loss expectancy of a single event. And then you have your annual cost of a safeguard. So the ongoing upkeep of that safeguard that you're putting in place. And that's where you get your cost versus benefit analysis. So let's talk about a couple different common controls. There's the preventive, deterrent, detective, compensating, corrective, recovery, and directive. So when we talk about preventive, we're talking about something that stops attacks. And these could be fences, walls, DLP, data loss protection, IPS, intrusion prevention systems, ACLs that are firewall rules. Deterrent is something that would discourage somebody from violating a policy. You could have policies, you could have training, you could have security guards, but these are all ways of just trying to discourage violations to privacy. It's not going to actually stop it. Detective is something that will be able to identify unwanted activity or violations to policy. So it's monitoring for something that is a violation of policy. And that could be done with monitoring software, with cameras, with honeypots. Then you have compensating controls. So these are aiding in enforcement. That's going to be things like file backup, disaster recovery plans. These are like, okay, the event happened. Now, how do we get to a good spot quickly? Corrective is going to be return the system back to normal. So terminating malicious activity, rebooting, and intrusion prevention systems can also do some of that. With recovery, you have repair and restore after a violation. So something happened, similar to compensating, but you want to be able to get back to normal production as quickly as possible. Normally in a digital system, again, that's going to be backup and restore, high availability, VM shadowing. And then directive. So confine or control a subject into compliance with a policy. That could be verbal or written notifications, signage, and so forth, basically encouraging compliance with a policy. So we also have security controls assessments, and we're going to talk about here with the monitoring, measuring, reporting, and improving on this system. But one of the things as part of this reporting and measuring here is security controls assessment. So this This establishes the effectiveness of a security mechanism that's in place in the organization. It's typically meant for infrastructure. So the output of the report shows the gap in controls that are deployed in a secure infrastructure. Using a risk register, which is something that houses all the risks that are identified in the organization, the risk register can be used to document all the identified risks in the organization. With that in mind, you're able to prioritize. Once they've been identified, you can prioritize those risks. You can prescribe a corrective action, and then track that risk to closure. For reporting purposes, you can create a heat map or a matrix in order to show what the probability is of a risk occurring and what the damage potential is. That heat map should then give you basically, if it's high probability and high damage, those are the ones you want to focus in on. Low probability, low damage are the ones that you want to steer clear, or at least have a different risk posture for. So for continuous improvement, we have enterprise risk management and risk maturity models, which is basically looking to make your risk management mature over a period of time. And when you look at the progression here, you have an ad hoc approach, which is basically chaotic. It means that there's not a clear risk management process in the organization. You have a preliminary stage where the process is loose and it's decentralized. Not everybody's following it. Some people are. You have a defined, which is the next step in that maturity. And that is where there's commonality and standardization in the organization. You have integrated, which is then it's integrated into the business process, meaning that the business integrates risk identification and management in the overall business process. And then optimize means you're focused on achieving objectives rather than reacting. So you're looking, instead of reacting to the risks that come in, you're looking at building out projects and programs to address risk before they occur. So let's talk a little bit about risk frameworks. Two of the most common ones that you'll hear about are the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework. And the risk management framework and cybersecurity framework are very closely aligned. But the risk management framework is a prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor type of framework where you are preparing to execute the RMF. You categorize the impact of loss. You select the controls that are going to reduce that risk. You implement those controls. You assess whether those controls are working. You authorize the controls if the risk is acceptable. And then you monitor that system and try to identify whether that risk has changed at all since the implementation of the controls. With the cybersecurity framework, it's a little more simplified, where it's identify the risks, protect against those risks, detect risks, respond to them, and then be able to recover. And each of those we kind of talked about here briefly. There's several different other risk frameworks that you're going to want to know, and those are the ISO 31000 risk management guidelines. There's also the COSO, Committee on Sponsoring Organizations, ISACA's Risk IT, OCTAV, which is the Operational Critical Threat Asset and Vulnerability Evaluation. You have FAIR, which is Factor Analysis of Information Risk, and then TERRA, which is Threat Agent Risk Assessment. Again, I know we covered a lot of ground there, but I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you.